Good morning. I am Trina Innes. I'm the Executive Director of Sustainability Services at Alberta Municipalities, and I'd like to welcome you all to our RenuWell Program Update webinar. Before we start, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Treaty 6 territory. I am a first-generation settler of British descent and have benefited greatly from Turtle Island, growing up in Ontario, studying in New Brunswick, and practicing forestry on unceded First Nations land in British Columbia. I've enjoyed the privilege of living and working on Treaty 6 for the last 20 years, and I offer my thanks to the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for generations. At this time, I'd like to invite you to join in the chat and introduce yourself, your organization, and share where you're joining us from today. Today, I'll give a brief introduction to the Municipal Climate Change Action Centre, background on the Municipal Community Generation Challenge, and then turn it over to our guest presenters to share their RenuWell journey. And during the presentation, we invite you to type your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll answer as many of those as we can towards the end of the presentation. Please include your name after your question to help us facilitate the session. The Municipal Climate Change Action Centre was founded in 2009. It is a collaborative initiative of Alberta municipalities, the rural municipalities of Alberta, and the Government of Alberta. And we help municipalities plan and implement climate mitigation and adaptation solutions through tools and education and funding programs. Since 2009, we have administered programs involving electric vehicles and infrastructure, solar photovoltaics, climate risk assessments and adaptation plans, staffing grants for energy managers, and energy efficiency upgrades in buildings. And on behalf of all the municipalities benefiting from our programs, I gratefully acknowledge the contributions of our primary funder, the Government of Alberta, as well as other partners, including Natural Resources Canada, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and Prairies Canada. Since our inception, the MCCAC has helped 170 municipalities with funding and capacity building programs, and we've unlocked over 100 million in clean energy related investments across the province. Between energy efficiency and solar energy solutions, our participants are saving over $8 million per year on their energy costs and avoiding over 37,000 in annual tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Later this year, we'll celebrate 15 years delivering programs in Alberta, and in the coming weeks, we are planning some announcements about new programs. Now let's get into the Municipal Community Generation Challenge. In 2019, we initiated a collaboration with Alberta Innovates on the challenge funded by the Government of Alberta. And the challenge was inspired by a new regulation which enabled generating units using sources of renewable or alternative energy to qualify as small-scale generation. And if social, environmental, or economic benefits were conferred, they would qualify as a community generation project. The projects that we funded create benefits in the form of GHG reductions, diversification of the local economy, and other social, economic, and environmental benefits. And the projects were also responsible for transferring knowledge to inspire the replication of these projects in other municipalities. So today you're going to hear from the MD of Taber. They partnered with RenuWell and other local partners to implement a really innovative idea for repurposing orphaned and abandoned oil and gas wells into solar generation sites. And to set the stage for our conversation today, I'll play a 2-minute video showcasing one of the sites and then turn it over to today's presenters, Brian Pierce from the MD of Taber and Keith Hershey from RenuWell. And as a reminder, type your questions into the Q&A on Zoom and include your name with the question. And I'll turn it over to my team to cue up the video.
Oil and gas wells are everywhere in Alberta, and a lot of those wells have reached the end of life. They're not producing energy, and they can't be used for anything until the land is reclaimed. Alberta has a lot of sunshine too. We're talking 300 plus days a year. So, what if we could speed up the reclamation of abandoned wells by building solar power? That's the opportunity seized by RenuWell Energy Solutions. Turning abandoned wells into solar farms cuts remediation costs by more than 50%. Reusing infrastructure and roads shaves a quarter off the cost of the solar farm too. And it allows Alberta to add solar capacity without sacrificing valuable farmland. In 2020, RenuWell received funding to start on 2 pilot projects in the Municipal District of Taber. 2 years later, Iron and Earth and Medicine Hat College used the sites for a groundbreaking renewable energy training program. Indigenous and oil and gas workers were trained to install solar panels. Skyfire Energy's experts led the hands-on fieldwork, and then Skyfire followed through to complete the full installation. This is the Fincastle site, where 0.5 megawatt of solar power was installed in late 2022. And in March 2023, on the first day of spring, power switched on for the first time. Across both pilot sites, RenuWell has saved 8 acres of farmland and added 1.5 megawatts of solar power to Alberta. That's enough for 90 quarter-section pivot irrigation systems to irrigate more than 12,000 acres, just using sunshine. RenuWell, not just a proof of concept, a better way forward for oil and gas reclamation and for solar power development.
And now we'll hear from our presenters today.
Thank you, Trina. My name is Keith Hershey, and I'm from, actually was born and raised in Treaty 7 territory. My ancestors came to Alberta, actually, while it was still the Northwest Territories, and homesteaded in Treaty 7 at the turn of the last century. And from that background, I come from a farming family. My ancestors had come from Switzerland and Denmark primarily. And basically, one of the odd things in my life is that I have all the advantages of growing up in southern Alberta. Our family, my uncle and cousins still farm, the family farm. But as the farm became too small for both my father and his brother, my father ended up going into the oil and gas industry and ended up being a production operator, running an oil field in southern Alberta, which just happened to be on the same land as the family farm. One of the early southern Alberta Lower Manville plays was discovered under our family farm in just south of Rentham. So my background comes both from sort of the farming side and also the oil and gas side. For myself, growing up in Taber, and where there were 2 main jobs you would go into, either farming or oil and gas. And since our family had kind of gone from the farm, I ended up in the oil and gas industry. And I'm very grateful for Peter Lougheed and the incredible infrastructure he set up in Alberta with Alberta Innovates, of course, what used to be the Alberta Research Council and AOSTRA, and all of the different government programs like MCCAC that were created to help Alberta move forward as the technology around the world changed. And with the background that I received in Alberta, I ended up going into geoscience research. I did a lot of work on extending the life of existing fields in Alberta, but also had the chance to work internationally in Europe, Middle East, Asia. And I came back to Alberta at a time when our conventional oil fields were starting to decline, where I did a lot of the work, the early work in locating where to drill wells in southern Alberta, many of them in the Taber area. what I came back to is, I'll show on the next slide, is that we're really in a transition period. So if we could switch slides. So what you see here is that on the green line, Alberta is still producing a lot of oil-related products. In terms of our bitumen production, we are up well close to 4 million barrels a day. This is a very significant oil production. But the blue line, which is our conventional oil fields, this is pretty much all of the fields where you would drill and that oil would flow to surface without needing to steam it or dig it out of the ground. These conventional fields started peaking just shortly after I entered the geoscience industry in the mid-1970s. And so these fields, they peaked production mid-70s and they've been declining ever since. And now we're producing about 500,000 barrels a day from these conventional fields. And in spite of a lot of investment, it has not been possible to turn that production around. So effectively, Alberta is more and more dependent on unconventional fields, and that really has two impacts. One is that these fields are all located really up around Fort McMurray area. They have higher production costs than the old conventional fields, and also it takes away employment in southern Alberta, which have typically been, and a lot of the rural economies, the rural municipalities, which have really benefited from the conventional oil and gas industry. So next slide. So like I mentioned, I grew up in the Municipal District of Taber, the town of Taber primarily. You can see that, when I was growing up, Taber was a fairly large oil producer. And as of 2022, they're now the 25th municipality in terms of oil production. And if you look at the graph, this shows the oil production in barrels per day over the past 20 years, 25 years. And you can see there's been a steady decline. And in fact, if you project that line further, it looks like those fields will pretty much be end of life in about 5 years. This is a major impact, and to Taber area and to a lot of municipalities that are in the same situation. In fact, if you take the number of producing wells that are left, there's 10,000 wells in the MD of Taber, close to 10,000. Currently, there's about 1,800 that are still producing. The big majority are either suspended or abandoned, but not reclaimed. And if you take the average production, it's about 4.5 barrels per day per well. So obviously, this is not a trend that's going to continue for a very long time. Next slide. So this leaves a lot of problems socially, economically, and so on. We've got more than 170,000 inactive well leases in the province of Alberta. Each one is about 2 acres. So there's at least 340,000 acres of land that has been impacted by oil and gas production, but hasn't been reclaimed yet. There's big delays in this reclamation. And then one of the things that happened around the time that I left Canada to work overseas in the 1990s is that a lot of the multinational companies sold their southern Alberta conventional fields to smaller companies. And many of these smaller companies really couldn't manage the declining fields, and they really weren't prepared for the liabilities which came with those fields, and didn't have the capacity to be able to clean them up as they were legally committed to. There were a big wave of oil and gas company receiverships that started, as you see each one of the oil price declines, 2014, 2020, and so on. There's been a lot of bankruptcies, and this has left wells in the Oil and Gas Orphan Well Association, where they're up to about 10,000 sites that they need to manage. And the Alberta government is compensating landowners with lease rental. And this is becoming a very major issue. And I'm going to turn this over to Brian Pierce from the Municipal District of Taber, who'll give you a much more focused and refined picture of how this is impacting the Municipal District of Taber. You're muted, Brian.
Sorry about that. Good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Pierce. I work for the MD of Taber as their manager of lands, planning, and development. So I've been employed at the MD for about 10 years now, and I've seen a lot of changes in the oil and gas industry just in my short time here. So As Keith mentioned, I think we'll just proceed to see those changes even further as time goes on here, as it's a legacy oil and gas area that is continuing to be in decline. So when Keith came to us several years ago, I think started back in 2019, I guess, when we first were approached by Keith to look at this concept, and he had some questions of us that we couldn't answer due to our land use bylaw and some of our policies, and how would we entertain a project like this within the MD. So we've worked through some policy changes and through another program with the MCAC and Alberta Innovates to get where we are today. But so just to go back on why the MD welcomed Keith into our municipality here to look at this problem. He came to us with solutions to problems we were currently having already, so we saw it as a win-win. As you can see, some of the points here, we were getting calls from our residents and landowners out there. Just as mentioned, the smaller companies were in deep decline. They were going bankrupt and leaving messes and unclaimed liabilities out on the landscape. So we were getting calls about weed issues, and the burden of those weed issues were being put on the backs of the landowners. People weren't getting paid for their oil and gas rentals. The municipality wasn't receiving taxes from those companies that had gone bankrupt. And you'll see some of the pictures later, some of the environmental issues that we were facing, as well as with weeds comes sometimes fire and an increase in fire risk. So next slide, please. Well, Keith mentioned some stats about the oil and gas sector in the MD of Taber. As you can see, a lot of the wells that we have operated here in the past are no longer active. So out of the 12,000 or so wells that are currently in the MD that aren't reclaimed, that were drilled and are still active, it's a very small number. So you can see why that leads to certain problems. As far as taxes owing to the municipality, and last year the MD was outstanding for about $1.3 million, and across the province through all municipalities, it was about $268 million. So it's a substantial impact to municipalities and how they operate when we don't receive those linear taxes from the oil companies. Next slide, please. So the MD of Taber is in a pretty fortunate position that we own outright about 80,000 acres of land, and with that comes, because of historically was an active oil and gas area, there's a lot of wells on those lands. So we have about 600 wells on the MD lands, and as you can see, over the last 5 or 6 years, we've experienced a lot of decline, and it's resulting in a lot of companies not paying their rents and going into bankruptcy and becoming insolvent. So one of my roles is unexpectedly became filling out surface right board applications for rental recovery through what was the surface right boards, now the Land and Property Rights Tribunal. So currently we have about 8 companies that have gone bankrupt that we're applying for rental recovery on, to the tune of about $400,000 a year. And you can see that one of the major companies there that is Sandling Energy, that had over 1,000 wells in the MD of Taber, and about 135 or 140 of those were on MD lands. Next slide, please. And just some of the pictures that I've taken over the years here, none of which are very favorable as a landowner, obviously. Some of the contamination issues with spills and weed issues is probably one of the biggest things that we've dealt with. Next slide, please. Again, a couple more pictures of places you'd think you never see a gas or oil well in the bottom of wetland, and just the picture on the left is a previous site of a compressor station, I believe, and this is what they've left. So we've notified the AR obviously on these issues, and we're getting some results. So currently within the MD, there is a very active program with the Orphan Well Association dealing with these wells. So that's a positive that we've seen in the last couple of years. But it will take a lot of time to get those all dealt with. So I think we see that as a bit of an opportunity for Keith's program as well. So thanks very much. I think it's back to Keith.
Thank you, Brian. So Brian has pointed out a lot of the issues that are present in the MD of Taber, and there's a lot of municipalities that are suffering with these same problems. And interestingly, when I first thought of this idea, I wasn't really thinking so much about the abandoned oil and gas sites. My first thought was the oil field that's on our farm was still producing, and it actually was in an experimental enhanced oil recovery program, and was using a lot of electricity to run all the pumps for producing the oil. And around 2015, the price of solar came down to a point where it was really economical to use solar to generate power. So my first thought was to approach the oil company and use some of the well sites that were reaching end of life and put solar on that to help power the oil and gas operation. Unfortunately, that didn't really go ahead. There's been a lot of history in Alberta with liability management, complications for oil companies and so on, and then oil companies doing different transactions in the field under our farm actually got sold from one company to another, and so the project kind of stalled. And that's where I started thinking about the abandoned well side, and the first thing I did is start going to the Alberta Energy Regulator to look at how this could be done in a safe way. And as I was doing that, there started to be the explosion of solar in Alberta. Basically, the price of solar reached a point where it was competitive with oil and gas. Effectively, you can produce solar in Alberta for about $50 a megawatt hour. And in terms of equivalent pricing, in terms of energy content, that's equivalent to about $20 a barrel. And there's very few places in the world where you can still produce oil economically at a price of $20 a barrel. But one of the downsides is as the way that solar has become so cost effective for the most part is really to make projects large. And the reason for that is because it takes about the same amount of work generally to get a project from initiation, getting the land, getting it all the way through permitting and everything up to construction, whether that project is 1 megawatt or whether it's 100 megawatts, that amount of investment is fairly similar. And so that actually drives companies to bigger projects. And these larger projects have two issues. One is they require major allocations of land. And the other is because of the way Alberta is situated and there's many other jurisdictions that have had more experience with solar, much of the expertise for these large projects often comes from out of province. So next slide. Now, as Brian mentioned, there's been a big shortfall in oil and gas tax revenue for the municipalities in Alberta. This is a major challenge for many of these municipalities because often some of the rural municipalities have been dependent for up to 50% at least of their operating revenue from oil and gas taxes. On the plus side, with these growth of renewable energy projects, the Business Renewable Center recently calculated last year that these new wind and solar projects have generated more than $28 million in property taxes for Alberta municipalities. 7 municipalities, including the MD of Taber, received more than $1 million in tax revenue. And many of the projects, this was done in 2022, and some of the largest projects weren't even on the tax rolls by then. So this is hopeful that there's going to be revenue replacement through renewable energy for the rural municipalities. Next slide. But the other problem is that most of our solar resources are in southern Alberta, south of Edmonton. And this South Saskatchewan Regional District is one of the most heavily impacted ecosystems in all of Canada in terms of development. Also, this is because of the sunlight and because of the irrigation investment. This is an area that has extensive agriculture production. It's some of the highest value crops in Canada. And also because this is where the oil fields were, it has a heavy concentration of abandoned oil and gas infrastructure. Together with this excellent solar and wind resource, which drives renewable energy development, this area is heavily, heavily impacted by development. So next slide. So the other thing I want to touch on here, and I appreciate MCCAC for this slide. Thank you, Trina, for the many things. The that when we look at the way electricity is delivered in the province, of course, this is very top of mind lately with the grid alerts that have been happening in Alberta, is that in the past, we would always just set up large scale generators. This would either be where I live in BC, this would be on hydro dams, or in Alberta, primarily near coal mines, or near places where we were near a gas pipeline where natural gas could easily be brought into the power plant. And then these large power plants would be built, and then we would build large transmission systems, transmission lines that would bring the power from the generating station to the local area where the power is needed. And then there'd be a substation, which would then drop the voltage on the lines and put it into smaller lines, which run to your homes and businesses and so on. Now, in the past, we only had generation on transmission, and these are large projects. And in Alberta, whenever there's a new generation project that's connected to transmission, the transmission utility gets a notice to build new transmission capacity. And then these transmission upgrade costs are passed directly to consumers. Now, right now, whether you're talking conventional, like natural gas, or whether you're talking wind or solar, or whether you're talking cogeneration with heavy oil production, where you're generating electricity as a byproduct of the heavy oil production, all of these cases, you're connecting to transmission, and transmission lines are needed, transmission tariffs are needed to get the power to your house. Now, the other side, and this is what I'm going to talk about specifically with our projects, is smaller renewable energy projects like rooftop solar or smaller scale wind and solar projects, particularly solar, can be connected directly to the distribution grid. And they can provide power to the customers and your neighbors within that grid. And this is an area I think that we can really gain advantage in as things are evolving and with technology. So next slide. So one of the big motivations is, we all know Alberta privatized the electrical utility back in around the year 2000. And what they did is they basically broke generation so that anybody can put a generator in Alberta. And you get paid basically what the wholesale price of electricity is, and that changes every 15 minutes based on supply and demand. And because of that competitive system, the energy prices have generally stayed low. Last summer was a bit of an exception, but for the most part, over a 25-year period, the energy costs have stayed about 5 cents a kilowatt hour on average. Now, the other side of things, though, the distribution transmission side, these two functions were put into private companies, which are regulated monopolies. And the way that their regulations work is they get their costs covered plus 8% profit. Now, the 8% profit margin is fixed. So to get more profit, they just need to build more infrastructure. And there has been a lot of infrastructure growth, especially transmission costs. And transmission costs have basically tripled since 1999, and they've become one of the highest costs on your utility bill. Next slide. So this is where the RenuWell Project comes in. And as I mentioned, this idea kind of started with the concept of using solar to power existing oil fields. But then it kind of started really focusing on this abandoned oil and gas side, because there's a lot of land which is sitting that could be used. And this land has roads, it has power lines, and there's a lot of infrastructure there that could be readily adapted to solar. And also the workforce that manages these field operations. There's many skilled trades like electricians and people who are very familiar with working with infrastructure. And we came up with the idea that if we basically could retrain these people, that they could work both on the oil and gas side and then the oil and gas lease closure side, and also they could work in putting in the first steps on the solar generation. And this actually can help make the whole process cost effective. So this is really where the RenuWell Project came in. And our first idea was to look at some more orphan well sites. With the Alberta Energy Regulator recommended we talk to the Orphan Well Association. They provided a site for us that had been problematic, which I'll talk about in a moment. And that's where we basically went to the MD of Taber to see if we could get a development permit back at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, to see if we could get a development permit to try a pilot on this site. Next slide. Now, just to give you part of this reason why I feel this is so important is if you look at land use comparative analysis, the biggest solar project in Alberta right now is the Traverse project. That's 465 megawatts AC or 600 megawatts DC. And it takes about 3,300 acres in the in Vulcan County. Now, not all of that land. I mean, you could say that. I mean, particularly in this project, it was placed on lower quality agricultural land, mostly grazing land, and there's sheep grazing within that solar project today. So it's not a total write-off of agricultural land, but it is a major land issue, and especially for municipalities that have the requirement to manage land use. So this is a big issue. And it turns out if we took half, or just under half of the inactive oil and gas leases in the MD of Taber alone, we could generate that same 465 megawatts of solar without taking any additional land from farmland that hasn't already been taken by the energy industry. Next slide. So effectively, as Brian mentioned, it came to the MD, in fact, it was just after Christmas 2018, and said, hey, we need a development permit for this orphan well site that's in the municipality. There was no way the municipal district could provide that because there was no precedent. And so this is where the MCCAC played an extremely vital role. They had a program at that point called the Community Generation Capacity Building Program. And that was designed so that as a way to help communities come together and find ways to do smaller scale solar that connected the distribution network and could benefit the communities, their neighbors in the community around them. So we applied for funding to do public consultation, stakeholder consultation, together with the MD of Taber to help develop a policy to move this renewal idea forward. So we had a year of public consultation with the landowners, the Alberta Energy Regulator, RenuWell Association, Alberta Agriculture, all of the organizations you see on that list. And we still have ongoing conversation with the utility sector. But basically, we got strong support from all these sectors. And from that, we came up with a policy framework by the end of 2020 to say that this idea could work. Unfortunately, that's where the next program came in that Trina mentioned, the capacity building program. And we were one of 2 municipalities awarded funding for that to do a pilot program. Next slide. So the program we produced, or we submitted, was we were going to take 2 orphan well sites in the MD of Taber and convert these to solar. Our hope was we're going to get 2 megawatts of solar on these sites. And our objectives were to increase distribution connected solar, to support irrigation. I'll talk about that in a second. Conserve land for agriculture, accelerate some of the reclamation on the oil field side, create employment, do economic diversification for the MD, and generate revenue for both the MD and irrigation districts. And now our project outcome would be proof of concept this is possible. We could improve regulatory clarity and prove the capacity of this solar to offset transmission. Next slide. So we got the funding in 2020. We were awarded $2.3 million through MCCAC. And without that, this project could not have gone forward. So thank you, Trina, and all the support that you guys have provided. Now also, and I'll touch on this in a moment, irrigation is one of the critical part of development in Southern Alberta. Without irrigation, the community where I lived was in Palliser's Triangle, which was basically when the settlers first came, that area was deemed unfit for human habitation. But without irrigation, which started just at the turn of the last century, this would not be the valuable cropland it is today. Now, St. Mary River Irrigation District and Taber and Raymond Irrigation Districts, they control one of the largest networks in Southern Alberta for irrigation. And they have a power co-op that was designed initially to generate power off the water moving through the irrigation canals. And they contributed $1.5 million to this program to own these 2 sites to generate additional electricity for irrigation. I'll talk about that in a moment. Now, Skyfire Energy built the sites on these 2 orphan well locations, and Iron and Earth, together with Medicine Hat College, put together a training program where we were able to put 15 oil and gas and Indigenous workers through a training program to learn how to transition sites from oil and gas, abandoned oil and gas sites through solar with the same crew. So we now have this training program which can be replicated throughout the province. Next slide. So this is the Fincastle site, one of the 2 sites we approached. And it was first abandoned in 2008, then the company went bankrupt. And for about 10 years, there's this infrastructure sitting on the landowner's land, as shown in 2017. The Orphan Well Association got the file when the company went bankrupt, and they basically cleaned up the topside infrastructure, and secured the well so that it wouldn't leak or anything, but it just sat as they had so many other places that they had to deal with. And that's where it sat in 2021 when we had identified the site as a candidate for our pilot. Next slide. So this is the site before. Next slide. Now, the Orphan Well Association came in and did a fantastic job facilitating. They got rid of the topside infrastructure, abandoned the well safely, made sure that the well was sealed, groundwater protected, took care of all the things required, made sure there was no contamination, and we were able to start building the site in 2022. And this is the way it looked. The next slide. This is another site that had been a long-standing problem for the Orphan Well Association. This actually been an oil spill that happened before there was standard regulation in the 1980s. And there's contamination present still to this day on that site after extensive work by OWA. And this is the way, next slide, that it looks today. So now we have in this pivot corner where there'd been this contaminated infrastructure, we now have about 860 kilowatts of solar. Next slide. So in terms of performance, these blue curves are the predicted performance capacity factor, which is basically the percentage of total production you can have in any month. The blue lines are what we predicted, and the yellow dots are what's actually happened in terms of generation. And you can see that we're right on track with our prediction in terms of the generation on these sites. Next slide. Now, why I mentioned irrigation is the graph on the left shows the substation throughput in one of the substations in the MD of Taber that is a typical one where we have a lot of irrigation operations around it. You can see that in the months from January to May, there's a fairly constant load through the substation. And again, at the end of the season, another fairly constant load. But during irrigation season, this was from 2017, one of the drier years, very much like this past year. You can see that because of the irrigation demand to run all of the pumps to move the water, that there's a tremendous amount of electricity being used at that time. Now, with a standard utility, the distribution and transmission has to be big enough to hit the highest, to handle the highest load. But for the majority of time, most of that capacity isn't used. Now, what's great about solar is also seasonal. But you can see on the other graph that during irrigation season is the time when solar puts out the most energy. So it's a very nice complement to the loads that we have in Southern Alberta. Next slide. Now, this is also shown by the difference in between the off-peak and peak power prices through the summer. In Alberta, we have this competitive pricing system. You can see that the highest prices in peak power and also the biggest gap in between peak and off-peak is in these summer months when irrigation is flowing. And that's exactly when we generate the most power with these solar projects. Next slide. Another thing, of course, we all know is that solar doesn't generate electricity when it's dark. But the thing I wanted to point out is that the blue line on the graph is the demand. And during the summer months, you see that our demand is highest during the day and it's less at night. And that's also complementary with solar. Now, the other side is that we do have a point where as the sun's going down, we're still using a lot of electricity. So there's a bit of a mismatch. This is an area where only a couple of hours of storage can really make a difference to make these two trends align. Next slide. So we've, as mentioned in the video, we completed these projects at the end of 2022. We got them online in 2023. We had some delays due to getting meters and transformers because of the COVID-related supply chain issues. Effectively, in the end, we did match all of our metrics. Except we had to cut the size a little bit because of cost increases during COVID, but we got a megawatt and a half of solar, conserving 80 acres of farmland. OWA reported we reduced the reclamation cost by 5 years, or the time by 5 years, and the cost by about 80%. And we have created this additional revenue for the municipality and landowners, and we're distributing the learnings now to key stakeholders, like in this webinar today. And we're still now measuring this against the transmission build-out options. Next slide. So we're right in the middle of this pause in Alberta on renewable energy, which started at the end of August. And of course, this order in council came in that there was to be no new hydro or renewable energy power plants up until the end of February next month for any projects bigger than 1 megawatt. The AUC is looking into things like land use in terms of impact on agriculture, security requirements for cleaning up sites at end of life, development on Crown land, and so on. Well, it turns out our project is getting a lot of attention right now because the generated capacity of each site is actually less than 1 megawatt, because we're using about 2 acres a site. And our land, we're only using land that's previously disturbed by energy development. And there's thousands of inactive oil and gas brownfield sites on Crown land that could be converted without impacting anything else on the Crown land. And the land, energy we produce can offset local demand, which can reduce some of this grid issues. And we've been able to show through the AUC is validated that our grid impact is no different than the microgeneration systems. Next slide. So I think we have a number of advantages with the RenuWell process. And I think one of the biggest ones is, unlike just, it helps accelerate some of the oil and gas cleanup, reduces some of the costs there. It also helps provide a way of doing solar at a competitive cost to the large projects, but on smaller scale. And it can really be a community-driven solution. And unlike just cleaning up the wells, which has to be done, this also provides ongoing lease and tax revenue for municipalities and landowners. Next slide. But we do have some challenges. And one of the biggest challenges is with the utility system. And the utilities are going through a lot of disruptive change right now with these many changes in technology. So there's 2 things that we really need to be able to go forward. One is an easier way to get connection to the grid. And the other, there's 2 other things that would also be helpful. One is to be able to do this work on land while it's being rehabilitated instead of waiting till it's completely cleaned up and rehabilitated first before proceeding. And then another is to be able to do this work on Crown land on brownfield sites. Next slide. The reason I mentioned this parallel to microgen is you can see that for these small systems under 5 megawatts, there's only been 5 systems connected that are community generation. This just means that they're putting power straight into the grid without having an identified load right beside it that's owned by the same organization or same person. And of those 5 projects, there's been 3 in the past 3 years, and 2 of those were ours. So this has been a very slow growth area. On the other hand, microgeneration has exploded incredibly. And there's thousands of projects a year. And many of these projects are very similar size and have similar grid impact. But they just have different rules with the way that they get grid connection with the utility. And on the utilities side, there's also been a major impact, 27 projects built during the time of our work with over 1 gigawatt of generation. These projects took 5 years to go through because they're large projects. And we believe our projects, we've shown we can do these in much shorter time. Next slide. So here's some ideas that we've had. The MD of Taber put forward a resolution at the RMA a couple of years ago, or year from last November, suggesting that we could get the same treatment as microgen systems in the AUC proceeding processes. And this would allow us to get the grid connection much more rapidly and allow us to expand very rapidly. We've also made a request that we could do, as some jurisdictions like Saskatchewan have, that while the site is being cleaned up and could use bioremediation on site to clean up oil and gas contamination rather than digging the soil out, taking it to a landfill, that the solar could be done while that bioremediation is happening. So we made a request for this change, and we've been in consultation with Indigenous rights holders. And we believe that using some of the many brownfield sites on Crown land in Southern Alberta together with Indigenous communities could enable transition of some of these brownfield sites to solar. Next slide. So that's basically what I'd like to show about our project. I'd like to acknowledge and thank all of our partners and the funders, the Alberta government. As I mentioned, we could not have done this work without the MCCAC and the Municipal District of Taber. And you can see we've had great support from Iron and Earth in training, Medicine College, Skyfire Energy for building projects, Canadian Solar, and of course, SMRID and Eurocan, who have been our faithful partners throughout this work. Thank you for your time. Trina.
Awesome. Thank you, Keith and Brian, for the amazing presentation. We are now opening up the webinar to questions, and please pop them into the Q&A box. And to start off, I have a question from Mark Doran. He's not opposed to converting former oil and gas sites for use as solar or other uses. However, he feels the land must be certified as reclaimed, the oil and gas lease must be surrendered, and a new lease must be signed. Solar is not a surface rights activity like an oil and gas well. Therefore, a well site surface lease agreement can't be covered into a solar activity leased or converted, I guess. Are these principles being observed is the question.
Hey, Mark, thank you for those questions, and you have hit some really key concepts that I didn't have to talk about, and thank you for bringing them up. Yeah, otherwise I would have had to mention them in the presentation. But you're exactly right, Mark. The way things are set up now is that we must have the site must be ready for reclamation certificate prior to getting a new lease put in place. And in fact, the reclamation certificate has to end the existing lease before the solar lease can become active. So that's the framing we have with the AR right now. The only difference is the way that the oil and gas industry can save some cost is that under SED 002 at the AR, the landowner can accept the road and accept the power line as improvements, rather than the oil company being required to take these out before they get the reclamation certificate. But we can only work on sites that are not contaminated or the contamination has been cleaned up and it's past the ESA phase 1, so there's no contamination. And the other thing that we save the oil and gas companies on is that the solar, like typically the oil and gas companies would have to monitor the site for up to 5 years to make sure that the vegetation has reached 80% of it or 90% of equivalent capacity compared to surrounding area. And what we have negotiated is that the solar company can take the lease with the new lease, can take responsibility for the revegetation together with the landowner. Now, you've also raised the point about not having the same surface rights issues, and this is really key right now, and I think Brian can speak to this as well, that this is one of the concerns we have generally about renewables, and it's one of the things that is in the being discussed within the pause moratorium, that currently with an oil, if a landowner has no way to refuse an oil and gas lease on their land, that can be mandated. With solar, the landowner can refuse the solar lease. They don't have to accept it. But the other side is that if the solar company went broke and didn't pay rent, or the site was abandoned by the solar company, and with all of the infrastructure, or just maybe taking the valuable infrastructure away and leaving disturbance on the land, there's no orphan well association that would protect the landowner. So right now there's work being done within the moratorium to try to find a way to provide equivalent protection for landowners compared to what they have in the oil and gas side. So this is work that's still ongoing. Right now, it all has to be handled in the surface lease, and the surface leases that we have put forward as part of our program actually has liability management contained in there, and fits within this framework. I did mention that we do believe that there is opportunity for another type of closure that's being done in Saskatchewan that also would have landowner involvement, but we need to make sure those protections are there. Thank you.
Thank you. Question from Darren Stokes. He says your video indicated remediation costs of former oil and gas sites is reduced by 50%. Isn't it correct that all remediation dealing with contamination must be completed before the site can be converted to solar? One would assume there would be some reclamation savings, but all remediation should be dealt with first, so I don't believe there would be any remediation savings.
That's absolutely right. That was actually one thing we didn't catch in the video. It should have been reclamation saving. You're absolutely right about that. We ended up not catching that completely as a video got produced, but it's 50% or above of reclamation saving. There is this potential for remediation saving if we adopt something called alternate closure or LPR type closure, risk-based closure, where bioremediation could be done while a solar project is in place. But this takes another set of regulation that has been adopted in Saskatchewan that we're examining in Alberta. But right now we can't really save anything on remediation.
Question from Cal. Can you define a suspended well, and what criteria does a site have to meet to be deemed reclaimed?
Okay, basically when a well has ended production and been shut in, if it sits in that state for a period of time, I think it's 6 months, that the well has to be suspended. That means that the oil company has to take special measures to secure the well to make sure that there's not leakage or but the well could be reopened and reproduce or production could start again, but there has to be a certain amount of work done to secure that well. And once that's done, that's called suspended. And once it's suspended, it's supposed to go to, if it isn't reactivated, and very few suspended wells are reactivated, it's I think less than 5%. They're only supposed to stay suspended for something like 2 years, and then they're supposed to be abandoned. And at abandonment point, what happens is that the well bore has to be sealed with cement and capped and secured to make sure there's no leakage to surface or to groundwater. And then all of the topside equipment, the pump jacks and everything have to be taken off. The casing has to be cut 6 feet below surface. The site has to be tested for contamination. All that has to be cleaned up if there is any contamination. And then the site is put into a state where it starts reclamation. Now in reclamation, the road is supposed to be taken out and all of the vegetation is supposed to be put back. If it's cultivated, it's supposed to be put back into farming and it has to be monitored to make sure production reaches equivalent to what it was before or in the surrounding land. And also, if it's native grass or woodland, it's supposed to go back to where it's indistinguishable from the surrounding area. And that's part of the reclamation process. So by the time it's reclaimed, you should not be able to see where the site had been, where the oil and gas site had been. And that would include taking the roads and everything out. The difference for us is that we basically can keep the roads and we can work with the landowner on what type of vegetation they want to have going forward rather than having a mandated vegetation program. Next question.
So I have a question from Gary Winthrop. He asks, have you engaged the AER and how this could be applied more broadly? I believe they would need to make some fundamental shifts to policy and what the closure process and final requirements would be for O&G producers in order for them to be incentivized.
Yes, that's a really good point. Like one of the issues we're facing right now in Alberta, I think one of the reasons that the cleanup is not going faster is that if you're an oil company and let's say you've got several thousand wells in southern Alberta, the average cost of reclaiming those wells is about $100,000 a well. The reality is though that many of the wells, if there's no contamination, those wells are about $60,000 to go through the cycle. However, as soon as you find a site that's got contamination, then you have to start doing all the work to do the contamination. And those liabilities immediately go on your book. So it can be $1 million to address those problems. So people don't really want to look and find out that they've got $1 million problem. Some jurisdictions like Saskatchewan and California, Australia, and others have basically implemented a procedure where if you find there's contamination, what you can do is you can look at what is the best way to manage this contamination. And in fact, Millennium Environmental in Calgary is a leader in this area. And they worked with the government of Saskatchewan to implement policies similar to Australia and California, where if there's contamination found that's disclosed to the landowner, there's environmental work done to make sure that the contamination isn't spreading. And then a plan can be put in place to manage the contamination on site instead of digging out all contaminated soil and trying to restore it to its past use. In fact, one of the issues that can happen today is that a site can be reclaimed to previous use and then it can be paved over with a parking lot if it's part of the city. So there's a framework that has a different closure program been adopted in Saskatchewan. And I know there's discussions with the AER and Alberta Environment, and there was some, Alberta Environment has informed us that there's already some work in this direction that could actually incentivize some of this work within the province. So this is a very important area, and I think it's one that is being looked at, and we're definitely involved in conversations about how we might be able to help contribute to streamlining some of this process.
Another question from Gary. Unfortunately, theft of copper wire is too common, particularly on remote and unattended O&G sites. Does theft and sabotage concern you? And if so, what additional security accommodations would be required and how would those impact the economics?
That is an extremely good question. And yes, the Orphan Well Association can certainly validate this being a problem. So far, renewable energy projects have been relatively free of these problems. And I think part of it is that having projects in areas that are more visible and more, I guess, not as remote is one way of doing this. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be, it is a problem for everyone. And I guess it's just something that we have to find processes to deal with.
The last question in the chat, unless more get added, currently is from Daryl Kaminsky. Is it being considered that the irrigation canals themselves could be covered with solar arrays like India or California?
Yeah, we've certainly had conversations with the irrigation districts about this. And floating solar is definitely a viable opportunity. In fact, one of the things we've looked at with irrigation districts as well is the idea of using pumped hydro, where if there's reservoirs at two different heights, that floating solar could be put in on the reservoirs, but also the reservoirs could be used to pump water up during times of excess electricity and allow the water to flow back through a turbine for energy storage. But one of the things that we're learning is that often this is such an operational problem for the irrigation districts with the way that they drain the canals right to bottom at various times of year and different things like that, that hasn't been taken up. But I think there still is potential opportunity there for sure.
All right, this will be the last question for our webinar today. It is from David Dodge. Seems like this is one of the best ideas for reusing these sites. Do you have any encouraging signs that the rules will change so you are treated like microgeneration for these projects?
David, thank you for your question. Thank you for all the support you've given through the project. Yeah, there's obviously, this is one of the topics that is being discussed as part of the renewable energy pause. I must say there's no guarantee, but I know that this conversation is happening within government and within the AUC. So I'm keeping fingers crossed, but I feel confident that if we can get to a point where we can, even if we have a 3-month or 6-month time window for connection approvals, if we can cut the expensive study costs and we can have a little bit more streamlined system, it will definitely, this is a very viable solution for the province. And another thing I guess I would add is that it was recently brought to my attention that, and of course, this is no secret for many here, that there's been such an explosion of microgeneration in the province that the utilities can't keep up with the requests right now. So we're in a transformative and a disruptive change in the entire utility sector. And I think, while maybe the pause could have been handled differently, that the questions and the things that are being discussed are vital. And we're making decisions today that will either position Alberta as being a leader. Of course, Alberta is not the only jurisdiction in the world that has this problem of abandoned oil and gas and changes to the grid. If we can do this within Alberta and we can manage this in a successful way in terms of all the different moving parts, the utility side, the oil and gas side, and so on, landowner side, regulatory side, I think we've got a tremendous solution for the rest of the world that is also facing energy transition. So I don't have a perfect answer for you yet, but it's definitely a discussion, and I have confidence that Alberta will find a way to sort this out.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Keith, for sharing the RenuWell story. Working with you and your team has been a great pleasure. Your leadership and commitment to driving change in this space is absolutely inspiring. Thank you to everyone for joining our webinar today. To learn more about Action Center programs, you can visit our website, subscribe to our newsletter or social media. And we do have another webinar coming up on January 30th. You're invited to join us, Climate West, and the Edmonton Metropolitan Regional Board to learn how local governments are working together to assess and address climate adaptation. So thank you all for joining. Have a great day.